What if everything you were taught about giving was a lie? What if the one thing you believed would bless you is the very thing that's been binding you? Listen closely, because today I'm going to expose a truth so uncomfortable, so disruptive, and so spiritually explosive that many won't even dare whisper it aloud. Tithing is not a pathway to holiness. Tithing is not a divine requirement. Tithing, when taught as a command from God, is a sin. And some people will hate these words. Some will reject them instantly. Some will cling desperately to what they've been told for years. But truth doesn't bend because someone is uncomfortable. Truth doesn't tremble because tradition disagrees. Truth stands unshaken. When tithing is taught through fear and manipulation, it stops being a spiritual act and becomes a form of bondage. This happens quietly, subtly, and often under the appearance of holiness. Many people don't even realize they've crossed that line because the language surrounding giving is wrapped in sacred vocabulary, words like obedience, covenant, blessing, or faith. But underneath those words, the emotional pressure tells a different story. Fear replaces freedom. Guilt replaces generosity. Obligation replaces willingness. And when those emotions control the act of giving, that act becomes spiritually distorted. What was meant to be an expression of love becomes a transaction of survival. The moment someone says, if you don't tithe, you're cursed, the true message is no longer about faith, it's about fear. When someone insists, God won't bless you unless you give this amount, they're no longer teaching generosity, they're teaching spiritual bargaining. You stop seeing giving as an act of joy and start seeing it as a spiritual tax you must pay to stay in good standing with God. But this type of giving doesn't produce peace. It produces anxiety. It produces resentment. It produces an internal belief that you are constantly one step away from divine punishment unless you pay your dues. Fear-based tithing manipulates your identity. It convinces you that you're spiritually unsafe unless you meet someone else's requirements. Instead of seeing God as loving, generous, and relational, you start seeing Him as a strict landlord demanding monthly payments. You pray less out of love and more out of worry. You give not because you feel moved, but because you're terrified that something bad might happen if you don't. And once fear drives generosity, generosity dies. The entire essence of giving gets corrupted. It becomes a survival mechanism, not a spiritual expression. Manipulation disguises itself well. It often comes wrapped in scriptures quoted out of context, shouted passionately, accompanied by emotional stories of how someone's life turned around right after they gave. The message becomes, if you want breakthrough, give. If you want healing, give. If you want protection, give. Slowly, giving becomes portrayed as a magical formula, rather than an act of compassion. You're not encouraged to give because you want to bless others. You're encouraged to give because you want to avoid loss or gain something for yourself. That mindset is not spiritual. It's transactional. And the moment spirituality becomes transactional, corruption seeps in. People who feel manipulated into tithing often carry silent shame. They might struggle financially but still feel compelled to give out of fear of disappointing God or disappointing religious leaders. They may sacrifice basic needs for their families because they've been conditioned to believe that withholding the tithe is spiritual rebellion. Instead of giving from abundance or gratitude, they give from inadequacy. They give believing they are spiritually defective unless they participate in the system. This creates emotional exhaustion and over time deep spiritual confusion. The tragedy is that many people believe this fear-driven system is the will of God. They believe that pleasing God requires constantly proving their loyalty through money. They internalize the belief that their spiritual worth is tied to their financial output. But genuine faith was never meant to operate this way. The moment fear becomes the fuel, faith becomes twisted. You start living not with a sense of divine love, but with a sense of divine surveillance. You start thinking God is watching your bank account more than your heart. That belief damages the human soul. It fractures the relationship between you and God by placing a price tag between you. When religious leaders use fear to enforce tithing, they often justify it by saying they are teaching obedience. But obedience rooted in fear isn't obedience. It's submission. It's compliance. It's spiritual coercion, dressed as devotion. True obedience flows from trust, understanding, and willingness. When someone teaches tithing by painting a picture of a punishing God waiting to strike, they are manipulating emotions for control. They are using fear as a tool to maintain influence. And the more people fear, the more tightly they cling to the system, believing their safety depends on it. Spiritual manipulation often thrives in environments where people are hungry for hope. When someone is desperate, financially, emotionally, or spiritually, they are more vulnerable to messages that promise breakthroughs in exchange for giving. This creates a cycle where people in pain are targeted with teachings that promise relief, but the price of that relief is financial. This is manipulation disguised as ministry. It preys on vulnerability instead of healing it. It uses sacred authority to pressure people into actions they don't fully understand but feel too frightened to resist. Fear-based tithing also destroys the purity of generosity. Generosity is meant to be a reflection of love, compassion, and gratitude. It is meant to be an overflow of the heart. But when giving is fueled by anxiety, the heart cannot participate authentically. You might hand over money, but internally you feel empty, tense, or conflicted. Over time, this creates bitterness. You begin to resent giving altogether. You begin to associate spirituality with financial pressure. You associate church with demands rather than inspiration. The spiritual environment that is supposed to free you ends up binding you. And perhaps the most damaging part of this manipulation is the way it disguises the character of God. When people are taught that divine favor is conditional upon tithing, they stop seeing God as a loving Father. They see Him as a strict judge. They stop seeing Him as generous. They see Him as transactional. They stop praying with confidence and start praying with fear. They stop believing they are loved unconditionally and instead believe they are loved only when they give. This completely cripples spiritual growth. It replaces relational faith with performance-based religion. The essence of spiritual truth is freedom. Anything that steals that freedom, anything that replaces willingness with fear, anything that demands instead of invites violates that truth. When giving becomes compulsory, it no longer comes from the heart. And when it no longer comes from the heart, it no longer honors God. The act becomes hollow. The meaning dissolves. Fear steals everything that makes giving sacred. Tithing taught through manipulation is not just wrong, it's spiritually dangerous. It twists the soul. It confuses the mind. It damages trust. It suppresses joy. It distorts the divine image. And when people finally break free from that fear, they often discover something profound. Their desire to give returns. Their generosity awakens again, because true generosity was never dead. It was suffocated under fear. Only when fear is removed, does love have room to breathe again. The idea that God requires payment for love, blessing, or favor is one of the most damaging misconceptions ever introduced into spirituality. It reshapes the entire relationship between humans and the divine into something transactional, conditional, and deeply unhealthy. When people are taught that giving money is the key to unlocking God's love, they begin to believe that divine affection is something they must buy, rather than something they already possess. This belief slowly alters the way they pray, the way they think, and the way they see themselves. They no longer approach God with the confidence of children approaching a loving parent. Instead, they approach Him like tenants paying rent to avoid eviction. This corrupts faith at its core. The belief that God's blessings depend on financial offerings creates a hierarchy of spiritual worth. Those who can give more are seen as more faithful, more obedient, more devoted. Those who struggle financially are subtly labeled as lacking in faith or commitment. This turns spirituality into a socio-economic ladder, where wealth equals holiness and poverty equals disfavor. But this is not how genuine divine love works. Love that can be purchased is not love. It's a business transaction. Blessing that depends on money is not blessing. It's a financial exchange. And favor that must be earned contradicts the idea of unconditional grace. When people think God's favor is tied to tithing or financial giving, they begin to question themselves constantly. They wonder if they have given enough. They wonder if they have given at the right time, in the right amount, with the right attitude. Every struggle they face becomes a reason to blame themselves. If they lose a job, they wonder if they missed a tithe. If they get sick, they fear they didn't give enough. If life becomes difficult, they assume God is withholding blessings as punishment. This produces guilt-driven spirituality, where people measure their worth by their bank statements rather than their faith, character, or love. This distortion of God's character creates emotional instability. People feel constantly monitored, constantly evaluated, constantly at risk of divine disapproval. They begin to see God as someone who withholds affection unless compensated. This mentality mirrors unhealthy human relationships where love is conditional, rewards are based on performance, and affection is used as leverage. Many people carry wounds from such relationships in their personal lives, and when religious teaching reinforces that pattern, it deepens the emotional damage. Spirituality is supposed to heal these wounds, not replicate them. Another consequence of believing that blessings must be purchased is the pressure to sacrifice beyond one's capacity. People who already struggle financially push themselves even further into difficulty because they've been told that giving more will prove their faith or unlock a miracle. They may skip essential needs for the sake of fulfilling a perceived spiritual obligation. They aren't giving from joy, they're giving from desperation, from fear, from the hope that God will notice their sacrifice and reward them. But this mindset sets them up for emotional disappointment. When the breakthrough they hoped for doesn't come immediately, they blame themselves, believing they didn't give enough or didn't give correctly. This leads to cycles of spiritual discouragement and self-punishment. The idea that God's blessing requires payment also undermines the concept of divine generosity. A generous God gives freely. A loving God offers grace without condition. A compassionate God meets people where they are, not where their wallets allow them to be. When people internalize the belief that God will only act in their lives if they first pay a fee, they diminish the beauty of grace. They reduce the divine to a system of rewards and penalties. Instead of trusting in God's goodness, they trust in their own ability to pay for His attention. This shifts faith from relational to transactional. Emotionally, this mindset generates fear-driven compliance rather than heartfelt devotion. People participate in spiritual practices, not because they love God, but because they are afraid of losing His favor. Fear becomes the motivator behind prayer, behind participation, behind giving. But fear-driven faith is unstable. It's exhausting. It's emotionally hollow. Over time, it erodes the spiritual connection people once cherished. Instead of feeling uplifted, they feel burdened. Instead of feeling inspired, they feel pressured. Instead of feeling embraced by God, they feel under scrutiny. Another damaging result of this belief is that it creates a spiritual marketplace. Stories of people receiving miracles after giving money are often used as marketing tools, persuading others to follow the same pattern. This turns spirituality into a lottery system. Give money and expect a return. But faith does not operate like a vending machine where you insert a tithe and receive a blessing. When people begin seeing giving as an investment strategy for divine returns, their motivation shifts from love to profit. This corrupts the spirit of giving itself. It removes purity from the act and replaces it with expectation. Disappointment becomes inevitable when expectations are not met, and people begin to question their faith altogether. Believing that financial giving influences God's love also causes people to misinterpret hardship. Instead of seeing challenges as part of life or opportunities for growth, they interpret them as punishments for not giving enough. This creates unhealthy spiritual anxiety. People live in fear that any mistake or financial decision could result in lost blessings. They begin trying to control their lives by performing religious acts, hoping to maintain God's kindness through constant giving. This is not faith, it's fear-driven superstition wrapped in religious language. This mentality also drives people away from authentic spiritual relationships. When leaders reinforce the idea that God's love is conditional upon giving, people lose trust not only in those leaders but in the entire spiritual system. They feel betrayed, exploited, and manipulated. Many walk away from their faith entirely not because they rejected divine truth, but because they were misled by distorted teachings that exploited their sincerity. Once they break free, they often feel a mixture of relief and anger. Relief because they no longer carry the weight of financial obligation as a measure of holiness. And anger because they realize how long they lived under spiritual pressure. A God who demands payment to bless his people is no longer a loving father figure. He becomes a transactional ruler, a spiritual creditor. But the healthiest spiritual relationships are built on trust, love, and genuine connection. You cannot buy love. You cannot purchase grace. You cannot earn favor by meeting financial quotas. Anything that teaches otherwise is not only incorrect, it is spiritually damaging. People deserve to know that divine love is unconditional, divine blessing is not for sale, and divine favor is not a marketplace transaction. When they learn this truth, their faith becomes deeper, freer, and more authentic. They stop trying to impress God with their giving and start connecting with Him from the heart. Giving from freedom rather than fear is one of the clearest indicators of genuine spirituality. When giving flows naturally, it carries warmth, sincerity, and a sense of inner alignment. You feel a gentle pull inside you, a desire to contribute because something within your heart says, this is right, this is meaningful. But when giving is driven by fear, everything changes. The emotional tone collapses. What should feel uplifting becomes heavy. What should feel joyful becomes tense. The act loses its spiritual energy and becomes an emotional burden. And once fear enters the equation, the purpose behind giving becomes contaminated. Fear-based giving often begins with a subtle message. If you don't give, something bad will happen. This message may not always be spoken directly, but it hangs in the air. It appears in stories of people who supposedly suffered after withholding their tithe. It appears in warnings wrapped in spiritual language. It appears in emotional pressure disguised as gentle reminders. Over time, people internalize the idea that giving is not optional. It's mandatory for their safety. So instead of giving to express love, they give to prevent loss. This instantly corrupts the relationship between the giver and the act itself. When a person gives out of fear, they are not giving. They are paying. They are paying for security, for reassurance, for the hope that nothing goes wrong. Fear becomes the motivator, and fear is a poor motivator for anything spiritual. Fear can push a person to act, but it cannot connect them to something sacred. Fear can move the body, but it cannot open the heart. The heart closes when it senses danger, even if the danger is spiritual in nature. So every time someone gives under pressure, they feel themselves shutting down inside. Instead of feeling uplifted, they feel drained. Instead of feeling connected, they feel controlled. Giving from freedom produces the opposite effect. When you give freely, you feel larger than yourself. You feel like you're participating in something beautiful. You feel like your heart expands in the process. There is joy even if the giving requires sacrifice. There is peace even when money is tight. Free giving carries a certain purity that transcends the act itself. You feel spiritually aligned, emotionally grounded, and deeply satisfied because the act matches your values, not your fears. Fear-based giving, however, creates internal confusion. You question your motives. You question your worth. You question your relationship with God. Every time you give, you wonder if you're doing it correctly, if the amount is enough, if the timing is right, or if you'll experience consequences later. Fear creates a constant second-guessing loop. You start seeing giving not as a choice, but as a requirement. You stop feeling generous and start feeling obligated. This internal conflict becomes emotionally exhausting. One of the most damaging things about fear-based giving is the way it alters your perception of God. If you believe God requires you to give a certain amount, or else you'll be punished, you naturally begin to fear Him. You may not admit it aloud, but emotionally you feel intimidated. You picture God as someone monitoring your financial decisions, ready to react if you fall short. This distorts your entire spiritual foundation. Instead of seeing God as loving, you see Him as demanding. Instead of seeing Him as generous, you see Him as conditional. This emotional shift affects every aspect of your faith. But when giving comes from freedom, the relationship changes. You begin to see God as someone who celebrates your heart, not your calculations. You feel secure in your relationship with Him. You don't worry about missing a divine deadline or failing a spiritual test. You give because you want to, not because you have to. That sense of freedom deepens your connection to the divine. It makes you feel loved, not measured. It makes you feel accepted, not evaluated. Fear-driven giving also has long-term psychological consequences. Over time, people develop resentment. They may not express it openly, but internally they feel frustration. They feel taken advantage of. They feel used. They feel pressured. And resentment slowly poisons the emotional well of generosity. It becomes harder and harder to give from the heart because past experiences have conditioned the heart to associate giving with discomfort. What could have been a beautiful practice becomes something people dread. This is why many individuals who break free from fear-based giving often go through a period where they stop giving altogether. It's not because they've become selfish. It's because their spirit needs healing. They need time to separate giving from fear. They need time to reconnect with their own heart. They need time to remember what generosity feels like when it's pure. And once that healing happens, they often give more freely than ever before. Not because anyone forced them to, but because their heart awakened again. Free giving also cultivates gratitude. When you give freely, you become aware of how much you have. You notice your blessings. You feel connected to others. You experience the joy of contribution. Fear-based giving cannot produce gratitude. It produces anxiety. It makes you focus on what you might lose, not on what you have. It makes you worry about consequences instead of celebrating possibilities. Gratitude cannot flourish in the soil of fear. Another important aspect is how free giving affects relationships. When people give out of freedom, they naturally build trust with themselves, with others, and with God. They feel aligned, authentic, and empowered. But when they give out of fear, they build distrust. They start questioning the motives of those who ask for money. They become suspicious of spiritual leaders. They become guarded, cautious, and emotionally closed. Fear creates distance, while freedom creates connection. Free giving also leads to healthier financial boundaries. When you give peacefully, you give within your means. You give according to your values. You give without harming yourself. But fear-based giving often pushes people beyond their limits. They give money they don't have. They sacrifice essentials. They create financial stress because they've been taught that giving more equals greater spiritual worth. This is unhealthy, unwise, and unsustainable. The truth is simple. Giving is one of the most beautiful expressions of the human spirit, but it must be free to be beautiful. The heart must choose it. The soul must feel it. The mind must agree with it. When those three align, heart, soul, and mind, giving becomes sacred. It becomes an act of love, not an act of survival. It becomes a reflection of inner abundance, not outer pressure. Only in freedom can generosity shine the way it was always meant to. Tradition is one of the most powerful forces in human life. It gives people a sense of belonging, continuity, and identity. But tradition also has a shadow side, when it becomes rigid, unquestioned, and elevated above truth. Many spiritual practices survive not because they are correct, but because they are familiar. People repeat them because their parents did. Leaders teach them because they were taught the same way. Communities defend them because they fear the consequences of letting go. Tradition, once meant to guide, becomes a cage. And when it comes to tithing, tradition has shaped beliefs so deeply that people rarely pause to question whether the teachings align with truth or merely reflect long-standing habits. When someone says, "We've always done it this way," they're not giving a reason, they're giving a reflex. Tradition often encourages emotional loyalty rather than thoughtful understanding. People become attached to the comfort of repetition. They feel secure when practices remain unchanged. But spirituality was never meant to be preserved in stone. It was meant to breathe, evolve, and deepen. When a practice such as tithing gets frozen in tradition, it stops functioning as a living expression of faith and becomes an inherited obligation. People follow it not because their hearts understand it, but because their minds fear letting go. Tradition can shield people from uncertainty, but it can also blind them to truth. Many people never question the origins of tithing. because asking questions feels like rebellion. They fear upsetting their communities, disappointing leaders, or challenging sacred structures, so they stay silent. They follow along. They assume that what has been practiced for generations must be divinely sanctioned. Yet history shows that longevity is not synonymous with truth. Humans have carried countless traditions through centuries that had no spiritual foundation, simply because no one dared to challenge them. Spiritual traditions, especially, gain emotional weight. They become tied to identity. To question them feels like questioning God Himself. And so people hold on to practices with a fierce loyalty. Not because the practices nourish their spirit, but because they cannot imagine letting them go. But spiritual maturity requires the courage to separate truth from habit. It requires a willingness to ask, why do I believe this? Where did this teaching come from? Does it align with the character of a loving and generous God? Without such reflection, tradition becomes a shield that protects outdated beliefs. The biggest danger of tradition is that it can replace revelation. People stop seeking deeper understanding because tradition gives ready-made answers. They no longer explore, question, or dig beneath the surface. They rely on what they were told instead of what they discover. This is how tithing became a fixed rule for many, not through personal revelation but through inherited teaching. Leaders passed it down. Parents reinforced it. Communities structured their practices around it. Over time it became unquestionable, not because it was divinely commanded, but because it was deeply rooted in tradition. Tradition becomes problematic when it discourages people from listening to their own spiritual intuition. There are many people whose hearts feel uneasy about mandatory tithing. They sense something is off. They feel pressure instead of peace. They feel fear instead of freedom. But because tradition tells them that this practice is sacred, they suppress their inner voice. They override their intuition. They silence their doubts. They convince themselves that their discomfort is rebellion, rather than discernment. This internal conflict weakens their spiritual confidence and creates a disconnect between their heart and their actions. The power of tradition also makes it difficult for communities to evolve. People fear change. They fear that questioning one belief will unravel everything else. So they maintain tradition even when it no longer reflects the truth of their understanding. This creates generational cycles, where outdated teachings continue to influence new believers. Instead of each generation refining and deepening its spiritual awareness, they inherit dusty beliefs that no longer serve their growth. Tithing as a forced obligation is one of these inherited beliefs. It remains largely unchallenged because tradition reinforces its legitimacy. Tradition can also create a false sense of spiritual superiority. People often believe that following long-standing practices makes them more righteous or obedient. They derive identity from compliance rather than connection. Tithing becomes a badge of loyalty rather than an expression of genuine generosity. This mindset turns spirituality into performance. People measure themselves by how well they follow tradition instead of how deeply they live in truth. This shift is subtle but dangerous. It promotes conformity over consciousness, routine over reflection, and obligation over authenticity. Another damaging aspect of tradition is how it influences leaders. Many spiritual leaders continue teaching tithing, not because they have deeply examined its truth, but because they inherited the teaching themselves. Tradition becomes self-perpetuating. Leaders who teach it feel validated by communities that follow it, and communities feel validated by leaders who teach it. This circular reinforcement strengthens the illusion that tradition equals truth. Rarely does anyone pause to ask where the tradition originated, what purpose it originally served, or whether it aligns with the true essence of faith. Tradition also creates resistance to spiritual growth. Growth requires flexibility, curiosity, and openness, but tradition often demands rigidity. People fear the consequences of stepping outside of established norms. They fear judgment. They fear misinterpretation. They fear losing their place within the community. As a result, they remain confined within traditional structures that no longer reflect their spiritual maturity. Tithing becomes one of these structures, a practice followed out of fear of judgment, not out of genuine spiritual conviction. The beauty of spirituality is that it invites transformation. It encourages people to evolve their understanding as they grow. But tradition discourages this evolution by suggesting that the old ways are always superior. This creates a tension between individual revelation and communal expectation. Many people experience spiritual insights that contradict traditional teachings, but they hesitate to embrace them fully because tradition holds such a strong emotional grip. They feel torn between what they feel is true and what they've been taught is true. In the context of tithing, tradition has turned a voluntary act of love into a mandatory financial rule. What began as a cultural practice in ancient times became a universally expected law in modern communities. People follow it because it has been normalized, not because it resonates with their spiritual understanding. Tradition overshadowed the original purpose of giving, which was always meant to be a free, joyful, and heartfelt expression. The moment tradition becomes a substitute for truth, it loses its value. Tradition is meaningful only when it aligns with spiritual reality. When it contradicts truth, it becomes an obstacle. People must have the courage to examine tradition with honesty, to keep what aligns with love and release what promotes fear. Tithing, when rooted in tradition rather than truth, becomes a practice that demands obedience without understanding. True spiritual depth comes when people choose authenticity over habit, revelation over repetition, and freedom over inherited obligation. There comes a moment in every believer's journey when they have to confront the silent fear inside their heart. The fear that maybe God is disappointed in them. That maybe they aren't giving enough, doing enough, sacrificing enough, proving enough. This fear doesn't come from God. It comes from a misunderstanding that has been reinforced for centuries. A misunderstanding that convinces people their value to God is measured in coins, payments, percentages, or financial obedience. And when this misunderstanding grows unchecked, it turns faith into a performance, worship into a transaction, and relationship into obligation. That misunderstanding is the belief that God demands money as proof of loyalty. What people don't realize is that the deepest desire of God has never been money. It has always been transformation. It has always been awakening. It has always been the rebirth of the human heart. When teachings about tithing are framed as eternal requirements, where failure to give leads to guilt, fear, curses, or the threat of divine punishment, the focus gradually shifts away from the very thing God cares about most: authentic spiritual growth. The heart becomes blinded by pressure, and the person becomes enslaved by ritual. They give because they fear, not because they love. They participate because they are taught to avoid wrath, not because they seek intimacy. And anytime obedience is rooted in fear, transformation dies. Many people today are spiritually exhausted, not because they lack faith, but because they have been conditioned to believe that God is primarily interested in their contribution rather than their conversion. They think their spiritual worth rises and falls with the number printed on a receipt. They think divine favor can be purchased by meeting a percentage. They believe blessings must be unlocked by payment, as if God operates like a subscription service. But the truth is that this mentality strips away the freedom Christ paid for. It makes people forget that spirituality begins inside, not in their wallets. It creates believers who are rich in giving but poor in understanding, generous with their money but bankrupt in their experience of grace. The tragedy is that many give faithfully, but they do not grow. They donate consistently, but they do not transform. They sacrifice financially, but their spirit remains untouched. Why? Because transformation never comes from external acts alone. It comes from the renewal of the inner world. Your motives, your identity, your beliefs, your awareness. A person can give every week for decades and still feel empty, because money does not heal the soul. Money does not rewrite trauma. Money does not break addictions. Money does not awaken compassion. Money does not create wisdom. Money does not open the eyes of the heart. Giving money is simple. Surrendering the ego, letting go of pride, learning humility, walking in truth. These are the real sacrifices God wants, and none of them can be bought. When people are told that blessings depend on tithing, they begin to focus on the formula instead of the transformation. They think, if I give this, God will give that. They think faith operates like a vending machine, but formulas kill intimacy. They reduce the mystery of God into a mechanical exchange. They make the believer more interested in receiving than becoming. And slowly, without noticing, they become spiritually shallow, busy with religious activity but lacking depth. This is why so many believers feel like something is missing. They follow the rules, they perform the rituals, they sit in the services, but deep inside their hearts remain unchanged, unchallenged, and untouched. Transformation requires honesty. It requires vulnerability. It requires facing the parts of yourself that money can't fix. It requires confronting anger, insecurity, resentment, pride, jealousy, fear. It requires learning to listen, learning to love, learning to forgive. But if a believer is taught that their primary spiritual duty is to give money, they will never be pushed to confront these deeper layers. They will believe they are doing enough, even though the inner work remains undone. Tithing, when presented incorrectly, becomes a distraction from the real transformation God desires. God is not after 10% of your income. He is after 100% of your heart. He is after your character, your integrity, your compassion, your courage, your humility, your self-awareness. These cannot be purchased. These cannot be outsourced. These cannot be replaced by financial giving. They require effort, reflection, struggle, surrender. They require daily alignment, not weekly donations. They require willingness, not obligation. Some people give generously, but treat others with cruelty. Some donate faithfully but refuse to forgive. Some support ministries but ignore their family. Some invest in church buildings but never invest in their own inner growth. This is the imbalance that occurs when giving replaces becoming. It produces believers who appear spiritual from the outside but remain spiritually weak on the inside. Their generosity hides their lack of transformation. And because their giving is applauded, they never realize the deeper work God is calling them to do. Transformation is not achieved through transactions. It is born through encounters with truth, with conviction, with love, with revelation. Encounters that challenge your identity, break your patterns, and reshape your destiny. These encounters happen when you sit in silence with God, not when you hand over money. They happen when you open your heart, not your wallet. They happen when you surrender control, not when you calculate percentages. The shocking truth is that many believers never experience the fullness of spiritual awakening because they have been conditioned to believe that financial giving is the central expression of faith. And while generosity is noble and beautiful, it becomes spiritually toxic when used as a substitute for inner change. God does not want you to hide behind your giving. He wants you to confront yourself. He wants your transformation, not your transactions. This is why it is so important to break free from teachings that place financial pressure above spiritual growth. When you remove the fear, remove the guilt, remove the obligation, something incredible happens. The heart becomes free to seek God authentically. The believer begins to pursue change, not payment. They begin to hunger for truth, not approval. They begin to grow, not simply give. And in this space of freedom, real transformation finally begins. There comes a time when a believer must step back and ask themselves the uncomfortable question they have avoided for years. What if the real reason I've been clinging to tithing is not because it transforms me spiritually, but because it gives me a false sense of control? People rarely admit it, but many rely on tithing not out of revelation but out of fear. Fear of losing blessings, fear of being cursed, fear that God will not protect them unless they pay Him, fear that their life will collapse if they don't follow a financial ritual they were taught to obey since childhood. And this fear quietly takes root, shaping their decisions, influencing their emotions, building a cage around their faith, without them ever noticing its bars. When a person believes their financial giving controls God's response, they are no longer walking in faith, but in superstition. They are no longer relating to God as a loving Father, but treating Him like a force that must be appeased. This is one of the most destructive spiritual consequences of distorted teachings about tithing. It replaces trust with anxiety. It replaces freedom with bondage. It replaces grace with formula. It replaces relationship with fear. And worst of all, it trains believers to misunderstand the very nature of God. Fear-based giving convinces people that blessings are fragile, that they can be lost if they miss one payment, skip one envelope, or choose to help a struggling family member, instead of depositing a percentage into a ministry account. It makes them feel like God is constantly monitoring their financial behavior, waiting for them to slip up so He can punish them. This image of God is heartbreaking, because it strips away His gentleness, His patience, His compassion. It turns Him into a strict accountant instead of a loving Creator. This fear becomes even more damaging when believers face financial hardship. Instead of finding comfort in God, they feel panic. They believe every financial problem is a punishment for not tithing enough or not tithing consistently. They stop trusting God's timing. They stop believing in His provision. They start seeing life through a lens of guilt, wondering what they did wrong, what part of the ritual they failed to perform. This emotional weight crushes the soul. It creates believers who give under pressure, who cannot find joy in generosity, who live with anxiety disguised as obedience. But fear-based obedience is not obedience at all. It is survival. True obedience comes from revelation, not coercion. It is born from love, not manipulation. When a believer gives because they genuinely desire to support others, to bless their community, to honor God through kindness, that giving becomes meaningful. But when they give because they fear disaster, curses, or rejection, their giving becomes a prison. Fear also distorts spiritual identity. Many Christians today define themselves based on how faithfully they tithe. They believe that non-tithers are spiritually inferior, less committed, or less blessed. This creates a toxic hierarchy within the faith, dividing believers into categories based on their financial contributions. Spiritual maturity becomes measured not by character, compassion, integrity, or love, but by monetary consistency. This mindset feeds pride in some and shame in others. It turns the church into a financial merit system, and the soul suffers in silence beneath it. Worse still, fear-driven tithing conditions people to ignore their own intuition and needs. A parent may feel conflicted when choosing between buying their child medicine and paying their tithe. A young adult may feel guilty for saving money to escape an abusive home because they fear not tithing will bring negative consequences. A struggling family may deprive themselves of basic necessities because they were taught that God requires 10% no matter their situation. This is not faith. This is spiritual abuse masked as obedience. No loving God would desire His children to suffer so they can meet a financial demand invented by human tradition. The fear surrounding tithing also prevents believers from experiencing true generosity. True generosity is spontaneous. It flows from compassion, not calculation. It sees needs and responds from the heart. But fear-based tithing makes people rigid. It binds them to a number. It makes them believe that anything outside of that number does not count. So when they encounter a homeless person, a struggling single mother, a sick neighbor, or an elderly widow, their instinct is not to help freely, but to preserve the amount they believe must be given to the church to secure blessings. Their humanity becomes overshadowed by their fear. This fear also blocks spiritual discernment. Instead of listening to God's voice for guidance on how to give, many believers simply follow the percentage because they were taught that the percentage itself is God's will. They ignore the quiet nudges in their heart, the opportunities for real impact, the moments that require creativity, courage, and compassion. Fear does not allow them to approach giving with spiritual sensitivity. It forces them into autopilot. It replaces revelation with routine. And as a result, their spiritual ears grow dull. The most tragic part is that fear-based teachings about tithing convince people that they are unworthy of God's love unless they prove themselves financially. They begin to believe that God's affection must be earned. They forget that grace cannot be bought. They forget that forgiveness is free. They forget that blessings are gifts, not payments. This belief steals the joy of spiritual life. It replaces gratitude with pressure. It replaces wonder with dread. It replaces confidence with insecurity. Breaking free from the fear surrounding tithing is not about rejecting generosity. It is about reclaiming spiritual freedom. It is about understanding that God's provision is not a reward for payment, but an expression of His nature. It is realizing that love cannot be bought, that grace cannot be purchased, and that blessings cannot be controlled. Real faith is trusting in God even when you give nothing, knowing His heart remains unchanged toward you. Some believers experience the deepest peace of their lives when they finally let go of the fear. They find themselves giving more joyfully, not less. They feel more connected to God, not less. They begin to live generously in all areas. Time, kindness, compassion, energy, encouragement. Because their giving is no longer confined to a number. It becomes a lifestyle rather than a ritual. It becomes an overflow of a transformed heart rather than a requirement of a fearful mind. The truth is that fear cannot produce spiritual depth. It can produce compliance but not transformation. It can produce routine but not revival. It can produce activity but not intimacy. To walk in real spiritual maturity, a believer must be free from fear-based obligations, especially financial ones. Only then can they approach God with openness, with authenticity, with trust. Only then can they truly grow. And only then can their worship become what it was always meant to be, an expression of love instead of a negotiation for survival. And so, after everything we have uncovered, everything we have stripped away, everything we have dared to confront, the question now turns back to you, not to your pastor, not to your tradition, not to the voices that shaped you in fear. The question is for your spirit, your conscience, your heart. What will you choose now that the truth stands in front of you? Will you continue living under the weight of fear, believing you must pay God to stay blessed? Believing you must earn what was already given freely? Or will you step into the freedom that has been waiting for you since the day you first believed? There is a reason this truth feels uncomfortable, because freedom always feels uncomfortable to those who have lived in chains for too long. There is a reason this truth feels confrontational, because breakthroughs are never born in comfort. They are born in honesty. But hear this clearly. God is not looking for your percentage. He is looking for your transformation. He is not after the number you place in a basket. He is after the courage you place in your decisions. He is not waiting for your money. He is waiting for your awakening. And maybe, just maybe, the reason you heard this message today is because something inside you is ready to rise. Something inside you is tired of fear, tired of guilt, tired of ritual, tired of performing. Something inside you knows there is more to faith than a transaction. Something inside you is ready for relationship, ready for authenticity, ready for the kind of spiritual freedom that lifts your head high and teaches you to walk with God, not pay Him. So today I challenge you, not as a critic, not as a rebel, not as a troublemaker, but as someone who wants to see you free. Let go of the fear. Let go of the guilt. Let go of the belief that you must purchase blessings or buy your way into God's favor. Let go of the chains that were placed on your spirit by teachings that were never meant for your destiny. Because the moment you release those chains, something miraculous happens. Your heart opens, your mind clears, your soul breathes. You stop giving out of pressure and start giving out of love. You stop serving out of fear and start serving out of purpose. You stop striving to earn God's approval and start living from the approval He already gave you. Your life cannot change if you stay in fear. Your identity cannot evolve if you stay in guilt. Your spiritual journey cannot deepen if you stay in bondage. Freedom demands courage. And today you have been given the truth that leads to courage. Walk into that freedom. Step into it boldly. Not tomorrow, not someday, not when the conditions are perfect. Today. Because when fear dies, faith finally lives. When guilt fades, grace takes over. And when you stop believing God wants your money, you finally discover He has always wanted something far more powerful. You.